Hello, podcast listeners. We know podcasts are a great way to catch up on a program that you may have missed on KSJE, and it's provided as a free service of this radio station. But, KSJE is now listener-supported, and so while you enjoy this podcast, we hope that you'll also take some time to join KSJE. Become a member today. It's quite easy to do. Just go to our website at ksje.com/support and pick the level of support that best matches your budget. Thanks again for listening. Here's your podcast. Joining me here in our visual radio studios this morning to talk about the newest book that she has written, Connie Nordstrom is here to talk about the book about her late husband, Frank Nordstrom, whose name should be familiar to many of our listeners and viewers this morning as one of Farmington's very first pediatricians. And Connie Nordstrom, good morning.
Good morning, Scott.
Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
And he was the first pediatrician in town,
The
right?
very first pediatrician, served the entire county for 20 years by himself.
And so lots of folks remember fondly Dr. Nordstrom, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
He delivered a lot of babies.
No, he didn't deliver.
Oh, he didn't?
No, he was not
Now, why did
an
I think he did?
obstetrician.
Pardon
he was
me.
a pediatrician. He
Okay.
took care of the children.
Okay.
But he did take care of all those premature infants and everything.
All
that
those
were born.
babies that were born
Problems.
from someone else, right? But he had to deal with all of those. And so
Right.
when you mentioned, so you've written this book. Let me back up just a second because I'm getting ahead of myself because there's so much to talk about with
Yes, there
with this
is.
topic at hand, everyone. But you have decided to write this book about Frank Nordstrom and all the things that he did in San Juan County and Farmington. And so let me start then by asking you about what prompted you to write this book.
Well, after he passed, I knew I wanted to honor him in the community, which he passionately loved and served all of his life. And I considered a lot of different things. I looked at possibly something at the library because he was so passionate about books. He served on the library board in his later years. I looked at the hospital, but he's already on the Hall of Fame wall at the hospital. And I thought about a park bench and just all of the things that people do. And then I realized that he was a book lover. He never read novels. He always read for knowledge.
Okay.
So I thought, I have had some experience with writing a book, and this is my second book, and I thought, I just have to write down his story.
And you did.
And I did.
And you did. And it took you about
It took me
year?
a little over a year.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And so how did you decide what to put in, what to leave out, or is everything in there, or are there still some things maybe that we don't know about Dr. Nordstrom?
I put in everything I could think of, and I started going through all of his papers, and we never talked about his early life. Just, as a historian, you're supposed to ask those questions
Sure.
of the people that you're closest to, but I didn't. And then I started going through all of his papers, and there were just piles of them, newspaper clippings and letters and all of the certificates of achievement and honors that he received, and I thought, wow, that started me. And then I have learned, since the book has come out and people are reading it, people stop me all the time and always have, to remember, condolences, and now it's people who've read the book say, well, I've got a story that you don't know about.
Right.
So, so there are, I'm sure there are even more stories out there.
Right. But you told me there's no volume 2
No volume 2,
coming.
no.
Not yet, anyway.
No.
Okay. All right. But this book is now available, and it has been published.
Correct.
And you are going to have a couple of events coming up that we want to let folks know about. And one of them is coming up next week here at San Juan College on August 14th as the Encore Brown Bag event at 11:30 when you will be speaking about your book.
Right, and I'm going to call that presentation More of the Story because of all these incidents that are coming into me. People text me, send me emails, call me, stop me on the street, with amazing stories of Frank. He was a character. He was a demanding man. He expected perfection of himself and of his patients, his mothers.
Right. Interesting. And so there's more to the story next Wednesday, August 14th here at San Juan College.
Correct.
And that is at 11:30. And then there's going to be a book signing at Artifacts, on two of them, on September 14th and on October 11th.
Correct.
And so those are also events that folks can
Buy the book.
and get you to sign it and talk to you a
Right.
little bit as well. But it's available elsewhere too, or just at these events?
Right now it's available from me, and all these people that I love. I wish I could just contact all of them, but I know people that are in the book that I have mentioned who probably don't know about the book yet.
Okay.
But you can call me. I'm in the phone book, and
Okay.
that is perfectly fine with me. The other place it is right now is at the Presbyterian Church.
Okay.
And,
For sale?
Yeah,
Okay.
for sale in the office.
At the church,
Yes,
at Presbyterian
at the
Church,
church.
on Dustin. Is that
On
the one
Dustin,
we're talking
downtown.
about? Right. So there you go, everybody. But I want to ask you about this book. And so, about Frank Nordstrom. And as you said, he was a demanding man. And so, as his wife, how was that to live with day in, day out? I mean, did you get used to that?
We were so much alike. It was unbelievable. They always say that opposites attract, but Frank and I were the same. I mean, and we were both sticklers for detail and incredibly hard workers. And
So that worked. That worked.
It worked beautifully. I ran the office, and he had great difficulty finding people in Farmington to hike with him when he first started hiking, because nobody was doing it. I mean, very few people had ever heard of backpacking.
And this is in the 1960s?
In the
Or
70s.
The 70s,
when we
okay.
met.
Even before
And
hiking was a thing.
before that, it was not a thing,
Right, right.
And so
Okay.
that's why I say he was a pioneer
Yeah.
in that field too. And he was so into backpacking that companies would send him equipment to test, and so he did that. And then
So he had a reputation there in addition to medical field.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I mean, he became a canyon guide, and he pioneered routes into southeast Utah canyons
Interesting.
that are still used today.
Right. And here we're talking about outdoor recreation and all these buzzwords and things like that, and he was doing that 40 years ago.
Right, right. He was, and the call of the Southwest was so strong in him, and that's why he came. That's why he came to San Juan County.
And he got here in what year?
54.
54, and I want to show a picture to our viewers who are watching us. This was 1963.
Yes.
So he had been here for a
9
few
years.
years, right? But he came to be that pediatrician, right?
Correct.
He came for his medical
He
field.
came for the medical field, and the reason he had grown up in Chicago and went to the University of Illinois, Chicago. But I'm going to backtrack here. He was an amazing student. He graduated from Duke University, 4-year degree in 2 years, from Duke.
Wow.
And then
Right.
he went to the medical school in Illinois, and he had been in the Navy, and then he joined the Air Force, and the Air Force sent him to Roswell. And when he saw
Okay.
those wide open spaces, he said, "I'm never going back." And he didn't.
That's what got him to fall in love with New Mexico.
That's what got him to fall in love with, the vistas and the skies and the canyons and the barrenness. It just touched his soul,
Right.
in a way that nothing did. And so when he called the University of Illinois and said, "I'm not coming back," and then he had to search around for a place to finish his residency, and he ended up in Denver. And then through another series we all have events in our lives that turn us in different directions.
Sure.
Frank had monumental events in his life. It was just one of the fun parts of the book. You just never knew what was going to happen next. But
Right.
he was looking around. He was looking in Grand Junction. And then he got called by Maxwell from the Maxwell Museum, who was living in Farmington and had an Indian trading business. Gilbert Maxwell.
Right, right.
And he called Frank and he said, "I want you to come to Farmington. I want you to come look at Farmington." He wasn't an official of the city or anything. He just did this
just
on
a
his own.
businessman, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So so Frank and Judy came to Farmington.
And Judy's his first wife.
Judy's his first
Right.
wife. Yeah.
And so he got back to New Mexico and decided that this community could use a good pediatrician.
He saw tremendous opportunity. I mean, this community in 1954 was absolutely exploding.
This was part of the boom era.
Yes, it was.
From the oil and gas industry, mostly gas, that Farmington was experiencing. And so you're right, there was a lot of people moving to town, lots of children, so you could start a practice.
Right, right. And he served the whole county.
Right.
And And then he immediately, the town was building a new hospital, so he got to be involved in that and the development of a pediatric ward eventually, very shortly.
Right.
I mean, the minute they opened the new hospital, they outgrew it.
Sure.
So
right.
it was just, and so Frank saw tremendous opportunity, and then he just couldn't resist the surrounding country.
Right. The outdoors, the hiking, the other parts of his life that he so enjoyed, and
Correct.
being able to live here and do that literally out your back door.
Right. Right.
In many instances. So.
Yes, after he'd been here for a while, he had a rental house, and then he had a house in San Juan Park, and then he bought a house on Glade Road. So he literally could go out his door and run up the Glade. He was a runner, and it just was where his soul was.
Sure. And this, for folks who know Glade Road, and it was probably not as developed then as it is now.
It was very wild.
I doubt there was a 30th Street. There may not have even been much of a 20th Street.
No.
At that point in time.
It was very...
So you were on the outskirts of the city, basically, is what you're talking about.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And I bet he loved that.
He did.
And being able to do all of that. And so let me show another photo, another drawing, actually. And this was actually drawn by...
my son.
Your son, right?
Who is he's a GIS analyst, a manager.
Right.
And he did a lot of maps for me in my other books. So I said, Doug, I need a map of Frank's world. And this is what he came up with. And it does show I didn't have him put the names of all the canyons on there, but it shows the canyons and the land that he explored.
And so he really loved southeastern Utah, is what you were saying.
That was his place. That was his backyard.
Right. And so you can see, for folks who are watching us this morning, and if you're not watching, you should be, get to a computer and go to YouTube or Facebook, and you can see what we're talking about. But this is the Four Corners states, of course, and you have Farmington and Shiprock prominently there in the lower part of your screen, Arizona over to the left side of your screen, and then, of course, in the upper part is all of that southeastern quadrant of Utah,
Correct.
Which was kind of Frank Nordstrom's stomping grounds, if you will,
right,
of where he would go. And you know, we always hear that when you're a physician in the medical field and you're on call 24/7, and so to disconnect and be able to go out into the wilderness, he must have really loved being able to get a chance to do that.
It was essential, because for 20 years he was on call 365 days a year, night and day.
Because he was the only pediatrician.
Because he was the only pediatrician.
So he couldn't take a day off, really.
That's right. And the family practitioners in town at the time, although they had a hard time with Frank because he had certain standards. Maybe he was a recent graduate of great medical schools, and he was really demanding. He was a perfectionist. He wanted it done right, and he wanted it done right the first time.
Right, yeah.
And but they did refer to him. Every time they had a problem, they sent him to Frank. So he was incredibly busy. And I was talking to Gwen Clothier the other day, and she said, you know, Frank had us trained. He was demanding, he was punctual, and he expected us, his patients, his mothers, to be the same way. And he was too busy to say it twice, is how I kind of think that it must have been.
And parents figured that out pretty quickly, I imagine.
They did, or they just didn't like him at all and wouldn't come back.
Right.
But most people tell me that he was gruff, he was demanding, but that he loved his kids so much. And he did a tremendous job. He just did a tremendous job for this county. But it was an incredible pressure, stress all the time on his life. I mean, his kids told me, we never had a dinner. We never had a family supper without interruption, without a phone call. And, I mean, at that time, his phone was published. They just called him at home.
Well, sure, right.
And, I mean, there was no emergency room. So if someone called and said, you know, I've got somebody cut their head open or something.
Off he goes.
Off he goes.
Right. And this was the era of house calls.
That's right. He made house calls.
You know.
I got to tell you a story there. This is a new story. I saw Mary Culpepper at the dog park the other night. And Mary said, you know, my little boy, this would have been in the late 50s, I believe, was so sick. He'd been sick for a day, and then in the early morning hours, his fever spiked. She said, it scared me. And I knew that Dr. Nordstrom had just gotten home from Albuquerque. And so here's the other side of the story. Frank flew himself to Albuquerque, had back surgery, stayed the night, flew home the next morning.
Flew himself?
Oh, no, in a commercial airplane.
Oh, okay, I'm just,
and you can
but
imagine.
still, sitting on a plane,
Yeah, this
a bumpy
is the
plane.
late 50s, boom, 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 and he supported himself on the arms of the seat so it didn't hurt his back.
Oh, my goodness.
And so he had just gotten home, and Mary said, I knew he just had surgery. But she said, I was scared. His fever was dangerous high. So she said, I called him. He answered the phone, 2 o'clock in the morning, and he said, I'll be right there. Drove himself to her house, checked the little boy. He had scarlet fever. Uh-huh. And Frank said, this is the kind of illness that makes doctors look good. So he gave him an injection of penicillin and said, call me in the morning. And by noon, he was well on the way to recovery.
Wow.
But that's the kind of dedication that he had.
Right.
That he just,
Well, and I think that's what we would hope we would hear about from physicians and doctors, but doesn't always happen.
Correct.
And we don't always hear about these stories as well as you've been able to document in this book.
Right. Well, and this was a unique time, too, these 20 years when there was no emergency room.
Right.
And doctors were still making house calls.
Sure.
So it wasn't like the doctor could say, well, I'll meet you at the emergency room or go down to the emergency room and they
can stabilize you or whatever.
And,
sure. Right. And I'll get there when I get there. Mm-hmm. But yeah. Interesting. And again, this is the time when Farmington is growing by leaps and bounds, and San Juan County is as well. We shouldn't just say it's only Farmington,
right.
But there was, I would assume, and I haven't seen the population numbers, but I know it's double-digit growth. It had to be.
Oh, it was, and I don't remember. It seems like it went from 3,000 to 23,000 in 10 years.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
It was just that massive, that huge of a jump.
Yeah. Oh, it was. I mean, I talk in my book about the facilities of the town were just, they had a terrible time.
Well, we've heard the stories about having school in the morning for some kids, and then half the kids would go to school in the afternoon because there wasn't enough classrooms for everybody.
With anything. I mean, they couldn't keep up with streets, with sidewalks, with all the utilities. It was just an amazing time.
Right. And so to be the only pediatrician serving this whole growing community when more families are moving here every day,
right,
had to be almost overwhelming. I imagine a lesser man probably would have just thrown up his hands.
Yeah, I don't know. I just know that Frank took it all so very seriously, and that's why when he slowly discovered the canyons. His first foray was to Shiprock, and he said, I just thought I'd come to the end of the world. I mean, Shiprock in 1954,
right.
First of all, the roads weren't paved.
Right.
And then he ventured from Shiprock to Kayenta on dirt roads.
Right.
And he just little by little he kept going farther and farther.
And you think about those formations you see on the way to these places and how amazing they still are today, but even back then, with less people, less cars, less traffic,
right,
even more so.
Terrible roads, and nobody was out there.
No.
So he began backpacking, like I said, but he went solo for a week at a time because he couldn't get people to go with him. It was like, people would look at him like, are you crazy?
Right. And this is an era, of course, with no cell phones, no GPS.
Right.
I mean, he needed to know where he was going and how to get back.
And that's what he, little by little, became so proficient as. He knew where the water was. I mean, and that's the bottom line.
Oh, sure.
If you don't know where the water is, you can't go in there.
Right.
And he knew where the water was. He knew the best way to get in there. And he just, I don't know, he loved it. I could see in later years when we would come back, we went out a lot, just the two of us. And we were exploring places that even he hadn't been into yet. And we would come back, and I could see the change in Frank on the drive back. From this carefree, happy. I mean, we had no responsibilities, no decisions, except maybe where to set up camp or what rock to sit on. And he, little by little, the reality of the pressures you could just see the change.
Coming back to town.
Back to town.
Knowing what he had to deal with. But then he didn't, because he retired.
He did.
In 1988.
Yes.
And so that was another milestone in his life.
And it was very hard decision for him. And honestly, what made him retire was the night call. You know, the being up all night with a premature infant, and then having to get up at 7 o'clock in the hospital in the morning to make rounds at the hospital. He just couldn't do it. I mean, we wear out. And he finally, if he could have had an office practice, period,
right,
he would have
solely
done it for a long time, because he did love those kids.
Sure. But even so, this was what, 33 years? Third of a century?
Yeah.
Is what the announcement says that we're showing everyone. So that's a long time with that type of a schedule.
Yeah, right.
And so so November 1st, 1988, and then how does his life change?
The first thing we did was move out of town. We
Now you made it sound like you couldn't wait to get out of town.
It was just, we wanted to be out in the country.
Right.
No,
okay.
I mean, no, we
because the
loved
town had
where
grown up around you at that point. I
Right.
would assume from Glade Road, if that's where you still were.
Well, we built a new house on
Okay.
Glade Road. And that was another one of Frank's passions. We
Right.
built a solar house.
Okay.
I believe one of the very first solar houses, passive solar houses
Wow.
in Farmington.
Okay.
He researched all that, and we built the passive solar house. And so we loved where we were.
Right.
You know, it wasn't that, it was we were ready for a new challenge, and we couldn't make that change when he was still on call.
No.
You have to live within a certain.
To respond to the
Of
hospital,
course,
of course,
yes,
right.
uh-huh.
You just can't
So
do that. So
when
then once
that-
retirement comes, sky's
Yes,
the limit.
That's right. Let's do something different. So Frank became a farmer, because we bought the house at Cedar Hill and 10 acres of land,
Okay.
and he learned to irrigate and cleaned out ditches, and you know, it was just it was a new challenge, and that's what he needed and what I needed.
And it sounds like he attacked that the way he attacked everything else in his life.
Everything.
With detail, and learned as much as he could about it to do the best job he could, and some of those same attributes
Right.
that he gave to medicine.
Yeah. Val Cooper said once, when Frank wrote a column for her column in the Daily Times
Right.
for a year, and she said that Frank tackled all of his passions in his life to the point of obsession. And he did. And, you know, I mean, it goes on and on. His reading, his writing. He wrote articles for magazines, and and then the newspaper, and his backpacking, his medicine, his solar energy research. It just went on. He became an investment advisor after he retired.
Interesting, right.
He studied and took the federal exams to become an investment advisor.
Wow.
So he was brilliant.
And tell me what you think he would think today about all of this talk about renewables and solar and wind and things like that. Would he be encouraged by a lot of these things that we're hearing about?
He would be totally in favor of it. He was very much an ecologist. Yeah. Here's a funny story that is not in the book, is that one time my daughter was coming home from college, and he said he wrote letters and wrote to my kids in college. He wrote this long letter to Dana, and he said at the bottom, "Be sure to take a 10-minute shower before you come home so we can conserve on water here."
You're on notice, kid.
That's right, exactly right. Only he meant it.
Well,
He
sure.
meant it. Yeah, because he was, that's why we built the solar house.
Right.
You know.
Right. Yeah. Very fascinating. And I imagine that was at a time when solar was not quite as
Oh, no, it was a new thing.
as available as it is today, and was probably a lot more expensive, certainly.
Well, it was
with
more
some
of
of the
a
technologies
counterculture thing at that time. But he went to Albuquerque with all the people who were doing this and studied, and our heat collection was oil drums.
Right.
And painted dark brown that stood in the front of the windows of south-facing windows of our
Okay.
house.
So this is like a passive solar type of a situation,
Right, and it was so warm in that house. It was so warm. My kids would come home from school and they'd say, "Gosh, I feel almost guilty. It's so warm in here."
Right. For nothing.
Yep. We didn't even have gas in the house.
Wow. All done with the sun.
The sun and wood-burning stoves if we needed.
At night. Yeah. Interesting. My guest this morning, everyone, Connie Nordstrom is here. She is the author of the new book about her late husband, Frank Nordstrom. Certainly a lot of folks will remember Dr. Nordstrom as the pediatrician in town for 30 some odd years, as we've been talking about this morning, and she has written a book about his life. Frank B. Nordstrom, 20th Century Pioneer, Pediatrician, and Canyon Guide is the full title of the book, and we are talking about it this morning. There is an event coming up next week here at San Juan College, the Encore Brown Bag Luncheon at 11:30 on Wednesday, August 14th, where Connie will be speaking about her book and telling more of the story. And the book is available at from Connie or from the Presbyterian Church in Farmington at the office. And there'll be another couple of events coming up, some book sales and book signings at Artifacts on Saturday, September 14th from 10 to noon, and also on Friday, October 11th from 5 to 9 p.m. And that October date looks to me like it's a art walk.
It is the art walk.
And so that makes perfect sense of why you would be there for that. But there's a lot of stories in this book about Frank Nordstrom, and probably a lot of things that maybe folks who only knew him as the pediatrician would find very, very fascinating. The whole other side to him as this canyon guide and outdoorsman and farmer and a lot of other things. I'm sure the list is incomplete.
Investment advisor, you know, on and on and on. He just, he never quit until he had to. Right.
And there's this picture, too, I want to show of him that maybe folks would remember, and that is him, looks like, outside as we show it here, if I can. Well, we will in just a minute. But
in Utah.
In Utah, right? Mm-hmm. This is the area that he loved, this canyon area of Utah, and so he would go out there, and you can see the smile on his face.
He was at peace. He was just absolutely at peace out there.
And so, but he retired, and so he didn't have that constant stress of the hospital and the care, of course, anymore. But yet still, I imagine his persona changed from being on the farm or at home to being out in the open and in the canyons and hiking and doing the other thing that he loved to do.
Right. One time, it was in the summer, it was July, and we had rain. And he was at work on Friday, and I said, Frank, do you have any appointments on Saturday? And he said, no, not yet. And I said, well, don't make any. And I said, as soon as you can get home, let's go to Utah. I said, I'll have the car packed, the food packed, clothes packed. All you got to do is come home and change your clothes. And that was a little bit, he said, really? And I said, yep, let's do it. Because it's cool enough, you know? So we took off and we explored, and we found the canyons, lands, the slick rock, all the potholes were full of water. And it was a totally different experience. And it was a little difficult for him to be so impromptu like that, you know.
I was going to ask you, right, if he did that a lot.
No.
Sounds like he didn't.
No, but I just thought, I had this wild idea, and I had the car packed, and I said, let's go. So we went over, and we threw our bags on the ground. We seldom put up a tent, unless the weather was inclement.
Right. So. But he must have loved that.
Oh, he did.
Did you do more of those things, or?
All the time.
All the time.
I used to say we spent more time on the ground in Utah in the spring than we did at home.
Which was probably a good thing for the two of you.
Miss it terribly.
I bet. So we just have a couple of minutes remaining this morning, Connie Nordstrom, and let me ask you a little bit about what you hope folks will learn from your book. Obviously, we're going to learn about Frank, but are there any other lessons to be learned?
Wow. I just think that being involved, being caring about people. I mean, Frank cared about his family, his friends. He just was a caring, loving person, and if he saw a problem, he wanted to do something about it. And I just hope the people maybe, I don't know if they'll read this book, the people that had just thought Frank was just a grump, that they'll see that the reason he was a grump was because the demands on him were so great. And I hope it brings great joy to the people that love him, the patients that love him. Well, and I think it will. It's
a great tribute to his life from someone who knew him and knew him later in life as well. And I think it's a great lesson to the rest of us to have that life well lived and to be well remembered afterwards.
That's right.
So, Connie, thank you for sharing some of your stories about Frank, and more of them in the book. And there'll be more next week here at San Juan College. So
thank you so much, Scott. Thank you.
You're welcome. Appreciate you being here. Connie Nordstrom, everyone, who has written the book about Frank Nordstrom, my guest here on KSJE. And I'll be back with more in just a moment. Did you enjoy that podcast? We hope that you did. And if you did, share it with your friends. And if you really want to keep podcasts like this coming, please support KSJE. You can do it easily online at ksje.com.